The sun was setting over a quiet little town nestled in the heart of America's Midwest. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on postcards or travel blogs, just an ordinary, unassuming community where life moved at its own unhurried pace. People here knew each other by name, greeted one another with warm smiles, and lived their lives surrounded by fields of corn and soybeans that stretched as far as the eye could see. To outsiders, it might have seemed dull, but to those who called it home, there was comfort in its simplicity. Among the townsfolk was Jake Carter, a man whose presence blended seamlessly into the background of daily life. At 34 years old, he had spent most of his existence in this very town, working as a mechanic at a small garage tucked away on the edge of Main Street. He wasn't flashy or outspoken. Instead, he preferred to let his work speak for itself. Cars came to him broken and battered, and they left running smoothly, thanks to his steady hands and meticulous attention to detail. Though Jake didn't realize it yet, his quiet nature would soon make him stand out in ways no one could have predicted. On this particular evening, Jake was hunched over the hood of a rusty old pickup truck, his fingers smudged with grease as he tightened bolts and adjusted belts. The radio played softly in the background, filling the shop with the sound of country music. Outside, the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, signaling the end of another peaceful day. Everything seemed normal, until it didn't. As Jake worked, he noticed something unusual about the horizon. Dark clouds were beginning to gather, rolling in like waves across the vast expanse of sky. At first glance, they looked like any other storm clouds, the kind that brought brief showers before moving on. But these clouds felt different. There was a heaviness to them, a strange energy that made Jake pause mid-task. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside to get a better look. The air smelled odd, sharp and metallic, almost electric. A chill ran down his spine, though the temperature hadn't dropped. Birds that usually chirped cheerfully in nearby trees had grown, eerily silent as if sensing trouble brewing. Even the wind carried an unsettling intensity, rustling leaves and bending branches in unnatural ways. Jake frowned, feeling a knot form in his stomach. Something about this storm felt wrong. Meanwhile, miles away in Washington, D.C., Senator Emily Hayes was wrapping up a long day of meetings. Known for her fierce dedication to rural communities, she had traveled to the Midwest earlier that week to listen to the concerns of farmers, teachers, and families struggling to make ends meet. Her visit coincided with a local community event, a town hall meeting held in a modest brick building near the center of town. Emily had always prided herself on being approachable, someone who truly cared about the people she represented. And today, as she stood shaking hands and exchanging stories with locals, she reminded herself why she had chosen this path in the first place. But even as Emily smiled and nodded along to conversations, her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw multiple alerts from meteorologists warning of severe weather heading straight for the region. Tornado warnings flashed in bold red letters, urging residents to take cover immediately. Concerned staffers hovered nearby, urging her to leave while there was still time. "Senator, we need to go now," one of them said urgently. "This isn't just a regular storm." Emily hesitated. Leaving meant abandoning the very people she had come to support. These weren't just constituents, they were human beings, facing danger, and she couldn't bring herself to walk away. "No," she said firmly, tucking her phone back into her pocket. "If they're staying, so am I." Her team exchanged worried glances but didn't argue further. They knew better than to try changing her mind once it was made up. Back in the small town, the dark clouds continued to swell, swallowing the last remnants of daylight. Lightning crackled in the distance, illuminating the ominous shapes forming overhead. Neighbors hurried to secure their homes, boarding up windows and gathering emergency supplies. Some headed to basements or storm shelters, clutching flashlights and blankets. Others, less fortunate, braced themselves wherever they could find safety. Jake debated whether to close up shop early and head home. His apartment wasn't far, but the worsening conditions gave him pause. Should he risk driving through increasingly chaotic streets, or should he stay put and ride out the storm in the relative safety of his garage? After a moment's consideration, he decided to stay. The building was sturdy, built to withstand strong winds, and besides, he reasoned, it wasn't as if tornadoes hit this area often, or so he thought. Little did Jake, or anyone else, know, this was no ordinary storm. What began as a distant rumble quickly escalated into a terrifying roar. Within minutes, the calm of the evening was shattered, replaced by chaos unlike anything the town had ever experienced. Trees snapped like twigs, roofs were ripped clean off houses, and cars were lifted into the air as if weightless. The tornado tore through the landscape with relentless fury, leaving devastation in its wake. At the community center, panic erupted as the building shook violently. Ceiling tiles fell, and walls groaned under the pressure of the howling winds. Emily sprang into action, shouting instructions to guide frightened attendees toward the basement. "Stay low, protect your heads," she yelled above the noise, her voice steady despite the terror unfolding around her. One by one, people scrambled down the narrow staircase, clutching children and belongings tightly. Just as the last person disappeared below, the roof caved in with a deafening crash, plunging the room into darkness. Jake, meanwhile, fought desperately to keep the garage doors closed against the raging winds. Tools flew past him like shrapnel, narrowly missing his head. Glass shards rained down from shattered windows, cutting shallow gashes into his arms and face. For a moment, he considered giving up and fleeing, but then the wall beside him collapsed, entirely exposing him to the full force of the storm. Realizing he had no choice, Jake dove into the reinforced storage room where he kept spare parts. It was cramped and suffocating, but it offered some protection from the maelstrom outside. For what felt like hours, both Jake and Emily endured the nightmare, separated by distance but united by the same primal fear. Neither knew it yet, but their fates were about to intertwine in ways neither could have imagined. As the tornado raged on, tearing apart lives and landscapes alike, the seeds of heroism were quietly taking root in the hearts of two ordinary individuals. One a senator determined to serve, the other a mechanic simply trying to survive. When the storm finally subsided, silence fell over the ruined town like a heavy blanket. Dust hung thick in the air, choking lungs and obscuring vision. Slowly, cautiously, survivors began to emerge from their hiding places, blinking in disbelief at the destruction surrounding them. Among them were Jake and Emily, two strangers destined to become unlikely heroes in the days to come. The tornado roared like a living beast, its deafening howl drowning out every other sound. It tore through the town with merciless precision, leaving nothing untouched in its wake. Homes that had stood for generations crumbled into splinters. Trees were uprooted and flung hundreds of feet away, their massive trunks reduced to kindling. Cars, once symbols of freedom and mobility, were tossed around like toys, landing upside down in ditches or crushed beneath the weight of collapsed buildings. In the community center basement, Senator Emily Hayes clutched her knees tightly, trying to steady herself as the world above seemed to collapse. The storm's fury was overwhelming. Every crash, every groan of breaking wood sent waves of fear rippling through the crowd huddled around her. Children cried softly, their faces buried in their parents' arms, while adults whispered prayers or held each other close, seeking solace in human connection. Despite the chaos, Emily forced herself to stay calm. She knew panic would only make things worse. Her phone flickered weakly in her hand, its battery nearly drained. Emergency alerts continued to pop up, warning of more danger ahead. "Stay indoors," they urged. "Do not attempt to leave shelter." But staying put wasn't enough, not when lives depended on action. Emily glanced at the frightened faces around her, feeling a surge of responsibility. These weren't just strangers. They were her people, the ones she had vowed to protect. If she couldn't help them now, what good was her title? "Listen to me," she called out, raising her voice to be heard over the din. "We need to stay together. Keep calm and we'll get through this." Her words carried authority, cutting through the hysteria. Slowly, heads turned toward her, eyes locking onto hers as if searching for reassurance. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the distant rumble of destruction outside. Then one by one, people nodded, drawing strength from her resolve. Upstairs, the building creaked and groaned under the pressure. Ceiling tiles rained down, followed by chunks of plaster and insulation. Water poured in from broken pipes pooling on the floor. Emily knew they couldn't stay here indefinitely. It was only a matter of time before the structure gave way entirely. She motioned to two volunteers who had accompanied her to the event. "We need to check the exits," she said firmly. "If there's any chance we can move to a safer location, we have to take it." The volunteers hesitated but nodded, grabbing flashlights and climbing cautiously up the stairs. Seconds later, shouts echoed from above. "It's no good. The doors are blocked." Their voices trembled with urgency. Emily clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. They were trapped, surrounded by devastation with no clear path forward. Meanwhile, miles away, Jake Carter sat hunched in the cramped storage room of his garage, listening to the storm rage outside. The walls shook violently, threatening to cave in at any moment. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe, and the dim light of his flashlight revealed jagged cracks forming in the ceiling. Jake's mind raced, torn between fear and determination. He had always been a practical man, someone who fixed problems rather than dwelling on them. But this was beyond anything he'd ever faced. He thought about the tools scattered across the garage, the crowbars, wrenches, and saws he used daily. Could he use them to break free if the worst happened? Or would he be buried alive without anyone knowing? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but he pushed it aside. There was no point in giving in to despair. Survival depended on focus. Suddenly, a loud crash reverberated through the space. One of the garage's main support beams had snapped, sending part of the roof crashing down. Jake instinctively shielded his head with his arms, wincing as debris pelted him. When the dust settled, he realized the storage room's entrance was partially blocked. Panic bubbled up in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. "You're not dying today," he muttered under his breath, gripping the flashlight tightly. With painstaking effort, Jake began clearing the rubble piece by piece. His muscles burned and sweat mixed with dirt streaked his face, but he refused to stop. After what felt like an eternity, he managed to create a small opening just wide enough to squeeze through. Crawling out on hands and knees, he emerged into the main area of the garage, or what was left of it. The once familiar space was unrecognizable. Tools lay strewn everywhere, shelves had toppled over, and shattered glass glittered like deadly confetti on the ground. Jake stood slowly, taking stock of his surroundings. The storm still raged outside, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. He grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar from the wreckage, shoving them into a makeshift backpack fashioned from an old tarp. Something deep inside told him he couldn't stay here. Others might need help, and despite his solitary nature, Jake couldn't ignore the call to action. As the hours dragged on, the full extent of the damage became apparent. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, streets blocked by fallen trees and piles of debris. Power lines dangled precariously, sparking dangerously in the wind. Survivors wandered aimlessly, calling out for loved ones or simply staring blankly at the devastation around them. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, surreal and heartbreaking. Jake navigated the treacherous terrain carefully, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every step brought new horrors. A family huddled, together in the remains of their home, clutching a photo album salvaged from the wreckage, a dog barking frantically, tied to a fence post near a collapsed barn. Each sight fueled his resolve to do whatever he could to help. Then, amidst the chaos, he heard it, a faint cry for help. Following the sound, Jake stumbled upon a horrifying sight. A young boy no older than 10 pinned beneath a heavy wooden beam. The child's face was pale, streaked with tears and dirt, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. Without hesitation, Jake dropped to his knees, assessing the situation. The beam was too heavy to lift alone, but he spotted a sturdy metal pipe nearby. Using it as leverage, he wedged it under the beam and pushed with all his might. Sweat poured, down his face and his arms trembled with exertion but inch by agonizing inch. The beam lifted just enough for Jake to pull the boy free. The child whimpered in pain, clutching his leg, which appeared badly bruised but not broken. Jake scooped him up gently, cradling him against his chest. "You're going to be okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "I've got you." Carrying the boy toward the nearest intact structure, a partially collapsed gas station, he laid him down on a blanket scavenged from a nearby car. Another survivor, an elderly woman holding a first aid kit, rushed over to tend to the child. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. Jake nodded curtly, unable to find words. He lingered only long enough to ensure the boy was stable before moving on, driven by an unspoken sense of duty. Back at the community center, the survivors finally ventured upstairs as dawn broke. The building was barely standing, its roof mostly gone and walls sagging precariously. Emily led the group outside, her heart sinking at the sight of the ruined town. What had been a vibrant community just hours earlier was now a wasteland of destruction. Smoke curled into the sky from fires sparked by downed power lines, and the air smelled of damp earth and charred wood. Emily took charge immediately, organizing the group into teams. Some scouted for food and water, others searched for medical supplies, and a few began clearing paths through the debris. Her leadership inspired hope, even in the darkest moments. People rallied around her, finding strength in her unwavering determination. As the sun rose higher, casting a pale light over the devastation, Emily allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She thought about her team back in Washington, wondering if they had received her emergency messages. She thought about the families she had met during her visit, many of whom were now missing or injured. And she thought about the unknown heroes who must surely be out there, risking their lives to save others. Little did she know, one such hero was already on the move, navigating the same ravaged streets she would soon walk. Though separated by distance, Jake and Emily were united by a shared purpose: to bring light to the darkness, to offer hope where there seemed to be none. The storm may have taken much from them, but it could not extinguish the resilience burning within their hearts. The morning sun broke through the haze of dust and smoke, casting long shadows over the wreckage that had once been a thriving town. The storm was finally gone, but its aftermath lingered like an uninvited guest, refusing to leave. Every corner told a story of loss: shattered windows, crumbled walls, and abandoned belongings scattered across the streets. Yet amidst the ruins, signs of life began to stir. Survivors emerged cautiously from basements, shelters, and makeshift hiding spots, blinking against the harsh light of day. They looked around in disbelief, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and grief. Jake Carter trudged through the debris-laden roads, his boots crunching on broken glass and splintered wood. His flashlight flickered weakly, its battery nearly drained after hours of use. He carried the crowbar slung over one shoulder and a tarp filled with salvaged supplies, bottles of water, canned food, and a few first aid items he'd scavenged along the way. Despite the physical toll of the night's ordeal, Jake felt a strange clarity settle over him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about helping others survive too. Each cry for help, each desperate face he encountered fueled his determination to keep moving forward. As he rounded a corner, Jake froze. Ahead of him stood the remains of the community center, a building he recognized from occasional visits, when picking up parts orders or grabbing coffee during breaks. Now it was barely recognizable, its roof gone and walls leaning precariously. But what caught his attention was the group of people milling about outside. Some were digging through rubble, while others tended to the injured or comforted crying children. And there, standing tall amidst the chaos, was Senator Emily Hayes. Emily moved with purpose, her voice firm yet gentle as she directed volunteers and reassured survivors. Her suit jacket was torn, her hair disheveled, and dirt smeared across her face, but none of that diminished her commanding presence. She listened intently to those who approached her, nodding thoughtfully before issuing instructions or offering words of encouragement. To the townsfolk, she was a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience and leadership in their darkest hour. For a moment, Jake hesitated. He had always preferred solitude, avoiding situations where he might be noticed or called upon to speak. But something about the scene before him stirred a deep sense of responsibility within him. These people needed help, and he couldn't stand idly by. Taking a deep breath, he stepped closer, his footsteps crunching audibly on the debris-strewn ground. When Emily spotted Jake approaching, she paused mid-sentence, her sharp eyes assessing him quickly. There was no mistaking the streaks of grease on his arms or the weariness in his posture. He was clearly someone who had weathered the storm firsthand. Yet there was also a quiet strength about him, evident in the way he held himself and the tools he carried. Without hesitation, she walked toward him, extending a hand. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone sincere. "We can use all the help we can get." Jake nodded, unsure how to respond. "Just doing what I can," he muttered, his voice gruff but steady. He handed over the supplies he'd gathered, explaining where he'd found them. Emily's expression softened, and she gave him a small, grateful smile. For the first time in hours, Jake felt a flicker of pride, not for himself, but for being part of something bigger than his own struggles. Over the next several hours, Jake and Emily worked side by side, forming an unlikely partnership. Their skills complemented each other perfectly. Jake's mechanical expertise proved invaluable as he rigged makeshift tools to clear pathways and stabilize damaged structures. Using scraps of metal and rope, he fashioned pulleys to lift heavy debris, allowing rescue teams to reach trapped survivors more easily. Meanwhile, Emily coordinated efforts, delegating tasks based on individual strengths and ensuring everyone stayed focused despite the overwhelming circumstances. Together, they transformed the chaotic scene into a semblance of order. Volunteers formed lines to pass buckets of water, carry supplies, and remove rubble. Medical kits were distributed among those with basic first aid knowledge, enabling them to treat minor injuries until professional help arrived. Children were kept occupied with games and songs led by older teens, providing a brief reprieve from the trauma surrounding them. Slowly but surely, the spirit of the community began to rekindle. Despite the progress, challenges loomed large. Food and clean water were running dangerously low, and medical supplies were nearly depleted. Many survivors bore injuries that required immediate attention beyond what rudimentary care could provide. Worse still, another storm system threatened to roll in, bringing fresh dangers with it. News reports trickled in via emergency radios, warning of potential flash floods and high winds. Time was running out, and tough decisions needed to be made. Jake and Emily convened a quick meeting with key volunteers to discuss their options. "We need to prioritize evacuating the most vulnerable," Emily said, her voice firm. "Children, the elderly, and anyone severely injured should go first." Heads nodded in agreement, though concern lingered in every gaze. The question remained: how? Jake raised his hand tentatively, drawing surprised looks from the group. Public speaking wasn't his forte, but he knew he had to share his idea. "There are abandoned vehicles everywhere," he began, gesturing toward the road lined with wrecked cars and trucks. "If we salvage working parts, we might be able to piece together a functional vehicle, or maybe even two. It's risky, but it's our best shot at getting people to safety." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed his suggestion. Finally, Emily spoke. "It's dangerous work, but it's worth trying," she said, her eyes locking onto Jake's. "Let's do it." With renewed urgency, the team split into smaller groups. Jake led a crew tasked with scavenging parts from nearby vehicles, while Emily organized volunteers to prepare the injured and gather essential supplies for transport. The work was grueling, requiring brute strength and meticulous attention to detail. Jake pried open hoods, yanked wires, and tested batteries, searching for anything usable. Others dismantled seats, tires, and fuel tanks, carrying the pieces back to a central location where Jake assembled them into a makeshift van. Hours passed in a blur of sweat, determination, and teamwork. By late afternoon, their efforts bore fruit. A rugged, patched-together vehicle capable of navigating the treacherous roads ahead. Though far from perfect, it represented hope, a tangible means of escape for those most in need. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in hues of orange and purple, the evacuation plan was set into motion. The van was loaded with the critically injured, including the young boy Jake had saved earlier, along with elderly residents and frightened children clutching stuffed animals and blankets. Emily climbed aboard last, taking a seat near the front to oversee the journey. Before closing the door, she turned to Jake, who stood watching silently. "You're coming with us, right?" she asked, her brow furrowing slightly. Jake shook his head. "I'll stay behind. Someone needs to keep things running here until help arrives." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but saw the resolve in his eyes. Instead, she extended her hand, again, this time gripping his firmly. "Thank you, Jake. We wouldn't have made it this far without you." He managed a faint smile, his usual stoicism softening ever so slightly. "Just doing my part." As the van rumbled to life and pulled away, Jake watched it disappear down the battered road. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders, but he squared them nonetheless. There was still work to be done, lives to save, and hope to sustain. And though he may not have realized it, Jake had already become more than just a mechanic. He was a hero in the truest sense of the word. Night fell once again, blanketing the devastated town in darkness. But amidst the shadows, sparks of humanity burned brightly. Strangers became allies. Ordinary individuals rose to extraordinary heights, and acts of kindness rippled through the community like waves. In the face of unimaginable destruction, the Mai people refused to give up. Together they clung to hope, guided by leaders like Emily and unsung heroes like Jake. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for now, they had taken the first step toward rebuilding, not just their homes, but their spirits. The makeshift van groaned and sputtered as it navigated the treacherous roads leading out of town, its patched-together engine struggling against the weight of passengers and supplies. The journey was anything but smooth. Fallen trees blocked, the way power lines lay tangled across the asphalt, and deep puddles from the previous night's torrential rains turned sections of the road into muddy quagmires. Yet despite the obstacles, the vehicle pushed onward, driven by sheer willpower and Jake's ingenuity. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Children huddled together in the back, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and wonder at the surreal landscape outside. Elderly residents sat quietly, clutching blankets tightly around themselves, while injured survivors winced with every bump and jolt. Emily Hayes remained at the front, her gaze fixed on the horizon, though she occasionally glanced back to check on the group. Her presence alone seemed to calm nerves, offering a sense of stability amidst the chaos. At the wheel was Marcus, a volunteer who had some experience driving heavy machinery. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he maneuvered the van through increasingly difficult terrain. Beside him, another volunteer relayed directions based on a crumpled map illuminated by a dim flashlight. "We're almost there," Marcus muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Just hold on." Meanwhile, back in the ruined town, Jake Carter worked tirelessly alongside the remaining survivors. With the departure of the first evacuation group, the pressure had shifted onto those left behind. Food supplies were critically low and exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone. But Jake refused to slow down. His mechanical skills continued to prove invaluable. He repaired broken generators to restore limited electricity, jury-rigged water pumps to access clean drinking water, and even constructed temporary shelters using tarps and salvaged materials. Despite his relentless efforts, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The second storm system loomed closer, its approach heralded by darkening skies and an ominous chill in the air. Every gust of wind felt like a warning, a reminder that survival depended not just on hard work but also on speed. Jake knew they needed reinforcements, and fast. As dawn broke over the horizon, the van finally reached its destination, a small hospital located in a neighboring town that had escaped the worst of the tornado. Relief washed over the passengers, as medical staff rushed to greet them, wheeling stretchers and carrying oxygen tanks. Emily stepped out last, her legs stiff from hours of sitting, and took a moment to survey the scene. For the first time since the storm hit, she allowed herself a brief sigh of relief. They had made it, but her respite was short-lived. As she helped unload supplies and ensure everyone received proper care, Emily's thoughts drifted back to the town they'd left behind. She thought about Jake, still working tirelessly to keep hope alive for those unable to evacuate. She wondered how much longer they could hold out without additional support. Determination surged within her once again. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Hours later, Emily returned to the van, now empty except for a few essentials she'd gathered from the hospital. Before leaving, she had spoken with local authorities, urging them to send emergency teams to the devastated town as quickly as possible. They promised to act swiftly, but Emily knew bureaucracy often moved slower than disaster. She couldn't wait for official help to arrive. She had to return sooner rather than later. The drive back was eerily quiet. The storm clouds above grew darker, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. Lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating twisted trees and abandoned vehicles littering the roadside. Emily's mind raced with questions. How many people were still stranded? What condition would they be in when she arrived? And most importantly, could they hold on until professional aid reached them? When the van finally rolled into what remained of the town, Emily was greeted by a sight that both broke her heart and filled her with pride. Survivors had banded together, pooling their resources and labor to create a semblance of order. Makeshift tents lined the streets, offering shelter to those who had lost their homes. A rudimentary kitchen had been set up near the remains of a gas station, where volunteers cooked whatever food they could scavenge. And at the center of it all stood Jake, covered in dirt and grease, directing operations with quiet authority. Emily climbed out of the van, her boots crunching on debris as she approached him. "You've been busy," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. Jake looked up, startled by her sudden appearance. "Senator Hayes," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "I didn't think you'd come back so soon." "I couldn't stay away," Emily admitted, her tone firm yet kind. "Not when there's still so much to do." For a moment, neither spoke. The bond between them had grown stronger during their shared ordeal, forged in the fires of adversity. Though they came from vastly different worlds, one a politician accustomed to boardrooms and podiums, the other a mechanic who preferred the solitude of his garage, they shared a common purpose. Together, they represented the resilience of humanity, the unyielding spirit that refused to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. Over the next several hours, Emily and Jake coordinated efforts to prepare for the incoming storm. They organized volunteers into teams, assigning tasks based on urgency and skill level. Some reinforced shelters, securing tarps and tying down loose objects to prevent further damage. Others collected rainwater in barrels and buckets, ensuring they had enough to last through the storm. Medical supplies were rationed carefully, prioritizing the most critical cases. Jake took charge of repairing damaged equipment, his hands moving deftly as he worked. He used spare parts scavenged from nearby ruins to fix a broken radio transmitter, allowing them to communicate with neighboring towns and coordinate additional aid. Meanwhile, Emily focused on morale, visiting survivors and listening to their stories. She reassured them that help was on the way, even as she privately worried about how long it might take. As evening fell, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering softly against makeshift roofs and pooling in cracks in the pavement. The wind picked up, whistling through gaps in the wreckage and sending shivers down spines. Despite the growing tension, the community held together, buoyed by the leadership of Emily and Jake. In the midst of the preparations, Emily found herself standing beside Jake, watching as lightning illuminated the horizon. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. Jake paused, considering her question. Then, with characteristic pragmatism, he replied, "We don't have a choice. We either stand together or fall apart. I'm betting on the former." His words struck a chord deep within Emily. In that moment, she realized something profound. True strength wasn't about titles or positions. It was about action, compassion, and unity. Whether in the halls of Congress or the ruins of a small Midwestern town, leadership meant lifting others up, giving them hope when all seemed lost. By midnight, the storm arrived in full force. Rain lashed against the ground, turning streets into rivers and flooding makeshift shelters. Winds howled like banshees, threatening to tear apart everything the survivors had worked so hard to build. Yet beneath the chaos, a remarkable transformation had taken place. Strangers had become neighbors, individuals had become a community, and ordinary people had risen to meet extraordinary challenges. Throughout the night, Emily and Jake moved from tent to tent, checking on survivors and reinforcing structures as needed. Their partnership had evolved beyond mere collaboration. It was a testament to the power of human connection, proof that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. When the storm finally passed, dawn broke over a battered but unbroken town. Exhausted but alive, the survivors emerged from their shelters, blinking against the pale sunlight. Among them stood Emily and Jake, two unlikely heroes united by circumstance and purpose. They exchanged a glance, wordless yet meaningful, before turning their attention to the task ahead: rebuilding, not just homes, but lives. Though the road to recovery would be long and fraught with challenges, one thing was certain: this community had weathered the worst nature could throw at them, and they had emerged stronger because of it. And at the heart of their story were two individuals who, in the face of unimaginable destruction, had reminded everyone what it meant to be truly human. When the second storm finally subsided, the town was left in even greater disarray than before. The rain had turned streets into rivers, washing away debris and leaving behind a thick layer of mud that clung to shoes and tires alike. Trees that had survived the initial tornado now lay uprooted, their trunks snapped like matchsticks. Roofs that had been patched together with tarps and duct tape were torn apart again, exposing survivors to the cold morning air. Yet despite the fresh wave of destruction, something remarkable had taken root, a spirit of resilience that refused to be extinguished. Emily Hayes stood at the edge of what used to be Main Street, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she surveyed the scene. Her clothes were soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the people around her, the ones who had endured unimaginable hardship, yet still found the strength to rise each day. She felt a deep sense of responsibility for them, not because she was a senator, but because she was human. These weren't just constituents, they were neighbors, friends, and family, and she wasn't going to let them down. Jake Carter emerged from the ruins of his garage, dragging a toolbox behind him. His hands were raw from hours of work, and his body ached from lack of sleep, but he didn't stop moving. There was always something else to fix, someone else to help. He glanced toward Emily, who was speaking with a group of volunteers, and nodded silently. Their partnership had become seamless over the past days, Emily organizing efforts and rallying spirits, Jake solving problems no one else knew how to tackle. Together, they formed a team that inspired everyone around them. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the battered landscape. It was a small mercy, but it brought hope. Survivors began emerging from their shelters, stretching stiff limbs and exchanging weary smiles. Children, resilient as ever, started playing in the puddles, their laughter echoing faintly through the air. For a moment it felt almost normal, as if the storms had never happened, but reality quickly set in. Food supplies were nearly depleted, medical aid was scarce, and fatigue hung heavy on every shoulder. Emily gathered the community once more, calling them to assemble near the remains of the gas station. When enough people had gathered, she climbed atop a pile of rubble so everyone could see her. Her voice carried across the crowd, steady and strong despite her exhaustion. "We've been through hell," she began, her words cutting through the silence. "And I won't lie to you, we're not out of it yet, but look around you. Look at what we've done. We've built shelters, shared food, cared for the injured, and kept each other alive. That's not luck, that's us. We did this together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others wiped tears from their eyes, but all listened intently. Emily continued, her tone growing firmer. Help is coming, but until then, we need to keep pushing forward. We'll divide into teams again. Some will focus on clearing roads, others on gathering supplies, and some on reinforcing our shelters. Every hand counts, every effort matters. Can I count on you? A chorus of voices answered in unison. Yes. The response was loud and resolute, a testament to the unity that had grown among them. With renewed determination, the community sprang into action. Jake led a team tasked with repairing vehicles abandoned during the evacuation attempt. Using parts salvaged from wrecked cars and trucks, he managed to get 2 more vehicles operational. These would prove crucial for transporting supplies and reaching stranded families in remote areas. Emily coordinated logistics, ensuring resources were distributed fairly and efficiently. She also worked tirelessly to maintain morale, reminding everyone that their efforts were making a difference. One afternoon, while Jake was inspecting an old tractor he hoped to convert into a makeshift plow, a young boy approached him hesitantly. It was the same child Jake had rescued from beneath the wooden beam days earlier. The boy held out a small, crumpled piece of paper. I drew this for you, he said shyly. Jake unfolded the paper to reveal a crude but heartfelt drawing of himself, lifting a car with superhuman strength. In bright red letters at the top it read, "Thank you, hero." Jake stared at the picture, momentarily speechless. Then, with a rare smile, he knelt down to meet the boy's gaze. You don't have to thank me, he said gruffly. Just promise me you'll keep being brave, okay? The boy nodded earnestly before running off to join his friends. Jake watched him go, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. For years he had lived quietly in the background, content to fade into obscurity. Now he realized his actions mattered, not just to himself, but to others. He wasn't just a mechanic fixing broken machines. He was a man helping rebuild lives. Meanwhile, Emily faced challenges of her own. As word of the disaster spread, media crews began arriving in droves, eager to capture footage of the devastation and the heroic efforts of the townspeople. At first, Emily tried to avoid the cameras, focusing instead on coordinating relief efforts. But when reporters spotted her leading a group of volunteers in clearing debris, they descended upon her like vultures. Senator Hayes, how does it feel to be here on the ground? One journalist asked, shoving a microphone in her face. What lessons can Washington learn from this tragedy? Another chimed in. Emily sighed inwardly, knowing she couldn't ignore them entirely. Instead, she seized the opportunity to amplify the voices of those who truly deserved recognition. Standing tall amidst the wreckage, she addressed the cameras with unwavering conviction. This isn't about me, she declared. It's about the people of this town. The farmers, teachers, mechanics, and parents who have shown incredible courage and compassion in the face of unimaginable loss. They are the real heroes. If there's anything policymakers should take away from this, it's that rural communities deserve better support. We need stronger infrastructure, improved emergency response systems, and sustained investment in these areas, because if we fail them, we fail ourselves. Her words resonated deeply both locally and nationally. News outlets broadcast her impassioned plea far and wide, sparking conversations about disaster preparedness and rural advocacy. Donations poured in from across the country, along with offers of volunteer assistance. The town, though still struggling, began to see glimmers of hope on the horizon. As weeks turned into months, the process of rebuilding gained momentum. Temporary housing units were erected to replace lost homes, and schools reopened in portable classrooms. Farmers returned to their fields, planting crops in soil that had been washed clean by storms. Slowly but surely, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Jake reopened his garage, patching up walls and replacing shattered windows. Business picked up quickly, not only from locals needing repairs but also from neighboring towns seeking his expertise. Though he remained humble, refusing to acknowledge his newfound fame, people often stopped by just to shake his hand or express their gratitude. The boy who had given him the drawing visited regularly, Bringing updates on his recovery and sharing stories of school and playtime, Emily, too, returned to Washington, carrying with her the lessons of the disaster. She championed legislation aimed at improving disaster preparedness in rural areas, advocating passionately for increased funding and resources. Her speeches in Congress were filled with personal anecdotes from her time in the devastated town, painting vivid pictures of resilience and unity. Lawmakers listened, moved by her sincerity and conviction. Yet even as their paths diverged, Jake and Emily remained connected by the bond they had forged during those harrowing days. They exchanged occasional letters, updating each other on progress and sharing reflections on the experience. Both understood that their lives had been irrevocably changed, not by the storms themselves, but by the humanity they had witnessed in their aftermath. Years later, when the town celebrated its official reopening, Emily made sure to attend. The event was joyous, marked by music, food, and laughter. Families gathered under newly constructed buildings, marveling at how far they had come. A plaque was unveiled in the center of town, dedicated to the heroes who had helped save lives during the storms. Among the names engraved in bold letters were Jake Carter and Senator Emily Hayes. As Jake stood beside Emily, watching children run freely through the streets, he felt a profound sense of peace. The scars of the past would always remain, but so too would the triumphs. Together they had proven that even in the darkest moments, ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. And though storms might rage again, they now knew they had the strength to weather them, together.